We tend to think of it as a sharp line because we tend to think in terms of the legal definition of the end of childhood, when majority occurs, when you're legally able to give your consent. You know, when you're in Nebraska, the age of majority is 19. So when you're 18 years, 11 months, and 30 days, and you're 15 minutes until your birth date, you know, you give your assent, and then 15 minutes later, all of a sudden, you're giving your consent. There's clearly no difference there. Assent is a concept that relates more to a person not being a truly autonomous agent who is able perhaps to say that this is something I'm willing to do, but because of a legal restriction or because of being on the spectrum of cognitive awareness, they're not really they're not really giving their full consent. So I see it as a spectrum. Assent and consent are on a continuum. And the idea that it probably the safest thing is to say it occurs at a particular time, but it's a fallacy to think that you're giving assent when you're 18, but 15 minutes later when you turn 19, you can give consent. When is a child able to make that decision for themselves, whether they want to participate or not? And at that, you know, from a legal point of view, that happens at 19 when it goes assent to consent. But when is a child really able to make their own decision, whether we call it assent or consent or whatever it is? And there it's a very, very, very fuzzy line. It depends on what you think is the relevant factor in agreeing to something. Is it because you agree because you understand the consequences? Is it because you agree because you name back the 8 required elements of consent? What is it that makes consent meaningful? When somebody says, I'll do it, what is it about that means, okay, you can do that, but you can't do that? That's a real hard thing to define. That's a really fuzzy line. And it sort of depends on how you define when you're able to give assent. And it's also not an all or none situation. We tend to think of that in terms of people who have cognitive problems, that there are certain decisions you can make and other decisions you can't make. You can decide whether you want coffee or tea, but you probably oughtn't to decide whether to buy a car or sell your house, right? The same thing could apply to children. You can perhaps decide you want to be in a research study which involves a single blood draw. You perhaps oughtn't, when you're 6, decide whether you want to be in a research study involving a phase 1 investigational drug. Someone who has a better understanding of the consequences of the risk-benefit relationship, ought to be deciding that for you. It doesn't mean that your opinion is not important in that. So one of the things that I believe strongly about assent is that if you are going to ask for someone to assent, whether that's a child or somebody who's, you have questions about their cognitive ability, you better be prepared to accept what they say. And investigators sometimes have a little bit of trouble with this, and what we'll say, are you going to ask for so-and-so's assent? And yes, we will, because that's the right thing to do. What are you going to do if they say no? Well, then I'll default to their parents and let their parents decide. Well, that really is fairly disrespectful. If you think that their parents ought to decide for them, then don't ask them. Then don't ask the child, ask the parents. But it's somewhat disrespectful to say to somebody, what do you think? Nah, I'm not going to pay attention to that. I mean, you learn that when you're trying to dress your kids. If you give them a choice of A or B, accept the fact that they're going to say A or B. You can't really say, well, you chose A, but I think B is a better choice. If you think B is a better choice, that's what you dress them in. Investigators don't want to do bad things, but they don't often think through these things because they're thinking through things that are I don't understand, that are much more important. They're knowing the metabolism pathway of this drug. It's important to know. I don't know that. I happen to think about this stuff. So they can educate me and I can educate them. So I don't usually get pushback from that aspect of it. You asked a question also about dissent, and I think there's something to be said that's a very different thing than asking for assent. And one can say that I still want assent, and I'm going to respect your lack of assent, and that's different than saying I'm going to respect your active dissent. I think you ought to be far more willing to accept somebody's dissent than perhaps to ask them for assent. If the kid's kicking and screaming, that's different than just not asking them for their grudging acquiescence to participate. So I encourage investigators to consider what they're going to do, not only if the kid doesn't provide their active affirmative assent, but what can I do if they pull their arm back and they say, I don't want to do this. That is different. And it has to be respected also.